Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Marengo. I'm a fundraiser here in Washington, D.C. I've been doing fundraising for over 30 years in various capacity with different kinds of organizations throughout the DMV and throughout the country. Today, we're going to learn about grant writing and how to empower musicians to write more grants so they can get the funding they need for their projects. The first thing I wanted to talk about is where the foundation and government funders are right now. Unfortunately, I don't know because an executive order was placed today suspending all federal grants, which means it affects the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities. And while NEA and NEH do a lot of work with organizations, the problem is that they also give a lot of municipalities funding. So for example, various years they've given the DC Commission, Arts Commission, anywhere from $9 to $11 million. And we don't know where that they are in the payment process. So they either got their money or they haven't. And if they haven't gotten their money, it's going to affect how payments are made to current grantees, or whether it's going to affect this year or whether it's going to affect the following fiscal year. So it's something you need to know because it affects not only just DC, but it also affects Maryland and Virginia. Because in Virginia, you have the Virginia Arts Commission, and in Maryland, you have the Maryland State's Arts Commission or Council. So it will affect both their budgets. And if you haven't already seen, Maryland is already going through their own issues with their current budget, so it may affect their Arts Commission or any of the grant-giving organizations within the Maryland state government. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, because there may be opportunities to apply and there may not be. And that's currently where we are with that. So there's two kinds of funders. There's government funders like your DC Arts Commission, your Maryland State Arts Commission, and Virginia. And then there are foundations. Many foundations give to individuals, so there's a lot of opportunity there. So when you're looking for funders, you need to know what you're raising money for. You can't apply just to raise money. You need to know specifically what you're raising money for, because that's what the application is going to ask for. A couple of things that I suggest musicians do is create an email. Because once you start researching, you can put yourself on various listservs. So like the Maryland State Arts, Baltimore has their own Arts Commission, arts organization. You have DC government, there's Humanities DC. So once you start adding, all these individuals, you want an email where the emails aren't going to get lost and, or go to your spam filter or anything like that, because deadlines, there are deadlines. A lot of organizations, take applications rolling, so you can apply at any time, but others have very strict deadlines. So you don't want to miss an opportunity because an email got into your spam filter. The other thing that I suggest is creating an online filing system. A lot of funders are going to ask for things like, what's your artist statement? They may ask you for budgets. They may ask you any number of things. And you want to be able to keep that all. A lot of funders will ask the same kinds of questions. So, if you have that question in one application, you can copy and paste as well as edit that response into the new application. So that way you're being more efficient and you're not doing double the work. So when you are researching, you just don't want to put in music and then call it a day. You want to be as specific as possible. The more specific that you are in your search, the better fit of funders that you're going to find. Because the idea is to find as many closely fitted funders to you. You just don't want what we call in development a spaghetti approach, where you just throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. You want to be more specific on who you're applying to, and that you'll get that list once you do your research. Now, where are you going to find these funders? So there's a couple of different ways. First, on a government level, obviously you can look at not only your city, but your county, as well as your state. So again, if you're in Virginia, it's the Virginia Arts Commission. In Maryland, it's Maryland State. In DC, it's the DC Arts Commission. When you're looking for foundations, obviously you want to look for a foundation database. What I recommend is that most libraries have a copy of Candid or the Foundation Center's directory, and it's free. You just have to be able to come to a library and use the database at one of their computer centers. Again, when you are doing the research, make sure you are looking for as specific funders as possible. When you start to narrow down that list, make sure that you read the entire application. Make sure that you can do everything within that application. Make sure that you can attach all the attachments. And one thing I always suggest doing is always doing the attachments first, because that is usually the largest amount of work. It may be that you can attach support letters or anything like that that would take time. So you want to make sure that if you do the attachments first, you're not scrambling at the very end. And when you read the entire application, you want to make sure that you follow directions. So if they ask you for a sample that's 1 minute, you're not giving them a half an hour. You want to make sure that whatever they ask specifically as far as attachments, that's what you're giving them. One thing I always mention is that when you are writing the application, make sure you answer the questions. That's the biggest pet peeve. As someone who also reviews applications, I can tell when someone doesn't know how to answer the question because there's like 5 paragraphs of nothing. What you can do is you can answer the question saying you don't know or you may not have information, but answer the question in the positive. Say I don't know, but we plan to use some money for evaluation, or we may pay for some money so we could have more of an analytical information of our website, or anything in between. So make sure that you're answering the questions as they are. It's something simple to say, but as a reviewer, sometimes I get very, very tired because I'm reading question after question after question, and it doesn't say anything. And if it doesn't say anything, it's going to drag down your entire application. So you want to make sure that you answer the questions as best as possible, but also be very pointed. If you could say something in 5 sentences instead of 5 paragraphs, that's better to do. A lot of reviewers aren't reviewing just one application. For example, when I reviewed for NEA, I was reviewing 40 applications. That's a lot of applications, and if I have to read a lot of fluff, it's going to take an effect. A lot of other funders, you may only have to review 3 or 4 applications or 10, but the fact is that no reviewer only reviews one application. So you want to make sure that your application is best as it can be, you're answering the questions, you're attaching everything that needs to be attached. When it comes to your budget, do not put in fluff. I have an analytical background, I do a lot of accounting, I do a lot of grant budgets. So if you start putting stuff in there that doesn't make sense, I'm going to know it, and then it's the same as lying. So if you lied about your budget, I'm just going to assume that you lied in the rest of your application, and that will bring your score down. Make sure that your budget is as detailed and as truthful as possible. You can always put in contingency lines. That's something I often tell filmmakers, but it goes for musicians. If you are, let's say, doing a video outside, you can put a contingency line just in case it rains. Whether you need extra money for extra crew or you need extra money for equipment or whatnot, it's better to put a contingency line and explain why that contingency line is in there, because then a reviewer is going to get a more positive view of you because you are being honest and you're telling us detailed wise why you need that extra money. Because if it's a contingency line, then you may or may not need it. But at least it's in there just in case that you do, and that we're aware of it. There's a lot of questions in the application that you may be asked. You may be asked, what are you going to do with your music? Are you going to do a concert? Are you going to do a video? Or what is it about that music that you're going to share? Because that's the whole point of writing a grant, because the funder wants to know what you're going to do with your music. Another question they may ask is how you're going to engage in your audience, and do you know your audience? A lot of funders want to know where the music is going to go after it's been funded and it's been completed. They also want to know who your audience is. Who does your music identify with? Does it identify with anybody? Where are you going to play? Or anything in between. A funder wants to know that if they give you money, that money is going to be well used. So the more detailed on where your music is going to go and what you're going to do with it is very important. Another question they may ask, and it may not necessarily apply to you, is they may ask what the impact of your music is going to have. Are you going to do a certain kind of a music that is detailed and resonates with a certain population? Are you using your music to tell a story? What is that story, and what kind of impact will that story have once it's shared with your audience? So once you've done your research, you've narrowed down your prospects, you have answered all the questions, did all the attachments, I would ask someone to review your application. You've been working on it for some time, you're going to get tired. You might as well have someone else look at it so that they can look at it and tell you what they think. Because, this application is going to go to a number of reviewers, and if there's something in there that they're not going to understand, it's better to find out before you submit, because once after you submit, that's it, you can't make changes. So have someone else edit, that way you could, get another view, especially if there's something in there that may be technical, or you may not think that a reviewer may understand, because not every reviewer has the same level of education. Well, not even education, but appreciation for music or any other artistic discipline. They may not understand that you're using this guitar rather than that guitar because this guitar can do this, or we're doing a video because we want to make sure that we're sharing it with different communities within the DMV. Having all this in your application and then having someone review it, you want to get someone else's opinion to see if it makes sense. Because it's going to go to another reviewer that is going to look at it and may or may not understand what your vision is. So always have someone else look at your application so you make sure that all your T's are crossed and I's are dotted. I always suggest that you submit your application early. Sometimes, and in some cases, funders will do a draft review, and so they may look at your application before the submittal date and say, I don't understand this, I don't understand that. So they may be able to then go back to you, unlock your application, and ask you to make edits. It's very rare, but in some instances it does happen, depending on who the funder is. Once you are done and you click submit, it goes to the funder. And different funders have different reviewing programs. So for example, most state and city funders, government-wise, will have what we call paneling. So there'll be a number of reviewers. It could be 2, it could be 4, it could be 10. And reviewers will review and score your application, and then they will sit in a room together and review your application. It gives an opportunity for panelists who may not understand or may not know or may not have an affinity for what you're doing. But there may be others who do. And so those who do can explain to others, who may know more on what you're doing. So they can share that information. So they can rescore so you get a higher score, because sometimes if someone doesn't know something, from looking at your application, they're going to score it low. So that's paneling. A lot of times, and it's almost always just government funders, you can get comments from panels. I always suggest asking if you do not, well, in either case, whether you get the grant or not, I always suggest asking for comments from the panelists. From foundations, 9 out of 10 times, they won't have the opportunity to give you those kind of scores or comments because they're not built for capacity like government is. A lot of foundation funders are using very few reviewers as opposed to government funders. Government funders are using, a larger amount of individuals. And one thing I always suggest is a lot of times these agencies, or even some nonprofits like humanities organizations, they are looking for and promote looking for reviewers. So, I would take that opportunity to be a reviewer because not only will you learn a lot, but you'll learn about what other reviewers are looking for when they review an application. So it's a great learning experience, and I always suggest doing it because there's a lot of opportunities to review grant applications. So after you submit your application, obviously you'll either be approved or not approved. And if you're not approved, then obviously ask for comments. But if you are approved, you're going to get a grant agreement. I always suggest reading the grant agreement because they may or may not be things in there that you may or may not agree to. They may be things like you have to acknowledge the funder in this particular way. Or there may be 4 reporting periods instead of 2 reporting periods, or you have to report this way, or you have to use their Excel spreadsheet, and so on and so forth. So you want to make sure that you read the grant agreement and make sure that you can do everything within the grant agreement. And sometimes it's important to read the grant agreement because it may be an agreement, but there also may be a stipulation in there, especially for government funders, that there may or may not be money. This is what you're technically awarded. It's not a guarantee. So it's important, because you don't want to already start spending money that you haven't gotten yet or may not get. So it's important to read the grant agreement. And that's grant writing in a nutshell. Are there any questions? Can I ask questions?
Can you talk about the different types of attachments and what you suggest if, like when they're asking for samples or examples of something and you don't have it yet because you're newer? What do you suggest?
So attachments could be anything from resumes of people involved in your project. So let's say you're doing a music video and there's a very specific story within the music video. They may ask for resumes of all the people involved in the project, everything from the cinematographer to the editor or whatnot. So that's a kind of attachment. Obviously, your budget is an attachment. They may ask you, or within the application, or it may be an attachment, and that's your artist's statement. Sometimes funders want to know who you are and what is your art and why you're doing what you're doing. Other attachments could be, especially on the government side, things like in DC, you may have to get a clean hands form in DC because they want to make sure that you don't owe more than $100 in tickets. So there's things like that, and there just may be other statements that you may need to sign and attach. Actual, musical attachments, funders want to hear what you're proposing that you're going to do. So they may ask for a sample of a song that you've already written or anything like that. And they will be detailed in the application on those attachments because there are no 2 foundations alike. Every foundation has their way of putting out an application, what the questions are in that application, what kind of attachments, whether they're rolling or they have due dates. We live in a country with the largest amount of philanthropic organizations. We have more than any other country in the world. Foundations and giving is a big thing here in DC. So there's a lot of funders And here in DC, there are literally hundreds of foundations headquartered here, and no one would ever know that because they don't take any beneficiaries. They have their own set of who they're giving. So, research is important. So you can find ones that are taking applications, but also there may be opportunities where there are foundations that will take what's called a fiscal sponsor. So some funders usually work with organizations, or there's a tax issue where, the money that they're giving out, with an organization who's a 501c3 or a nonprofit, it's something that they can write off. Giving money to an individual is not something that's necessarily a write-off. Because the person's benefiting. It's a different circumstance, but some foundations may take a fiscal sponsor. So you could go to, let's say, a DMV Music Alliance and say, do you have a fiscal sponsorship program? And that way you can apply for the grant, but the grant will go through the fiscal sponsor, and you work with them on how the money gets released, because the fiscal sponsor then has to go back and report that to the foundation. I'm trying to think of any other attachments. They could be support letters, maybe another attachment, other materials, such as like other songs or other performances that you've done that you can attach. It depends on the foundation. They're going to have their particular requests because, for foundations, it's all about capacity and what they can review and how often they can review it. So they're not going to, if they have one or two program managers or reviewers, they're not going to ask you for 20 attachments, because no one can review. If you only have two and you have 50 applications, it's a lot of reviewing that a reviewer can't do because it's just overwhelming.
I've just been trying to help a couple of nonprofits in town. I'm a retired lawyer and I don't have any training or experience in this area, so I'm trying to learn it as I go, as I try to help people. But one thing is I like what you said about getting the attachments first, because I think that was what held us up to, I just recently submitted an application, but it was like pulling teeth to get the documentation from the person who was the head of the nonprofit, and so that was painful. But I was thinking of it like project management. If you're a struggling artist, you might not have the best, like spreadsheet with deadlines and how to manage the process. And I think in hindsight, with the one that I did, the grant I worked on, I would have written down the deadlines, and then a month before that, I'm like, this is the drop dead date that I need these documents. So like use your calendar to give yourself deadlines.
Yeah, the one thing about foundations, it's the most involved funder type. It's easy to ask someone for money, a donor, or it's somewhat easier to get money from a corporate sponsor. But when it comes to foundations, it's not an easy fix. It takes time to put the application together. So if you don't have time, don't look for foundations. At least with government funders, the application's a little bit more streamlined, even though they may have more attachments than most foundations. But, foundations aren't, I apply today, I get funded tomorrow. They are getting hit up more now than ever before. COVID, a lot of funders just open up their checkbook because it was COVID and organizations were just closing their doors left and right. And so they stepped up, especially also with government funders, they stepped up with the amount of money they're giving out. The problem is now is that, they did that even though they didn't have the capacity to handle those kinds of, numbers. So now we are, in a time where it's like pre-2019. They're going back to what they were doing before. The problem is that the number of applications didn't drop. It just went up more. So a lot of foundations are being hit up with far more applications than they've ever been before, and they just don't have the capacity to handle them all. And so they're hate to say this, they're finding more inventive ways. Some funders will have some restrictions which may or not work for you.
They wanted like 3 years, proof of 3 years, so we had to go back and find like flyers from gigs that were held and just anything we could to document that they've been doing it for 3 years.
Well, that's one of the reasons why, like, I tell people to do the online filing system, especially if you are newer, because if you are newer, then you have all of that. So even 5 years from now, you have 10 years worth of stuff. Documentation is very important, especially if you're doing multiple applications or you're doing like 1 or 2 applications this year and 1 or 2 applications next year. You can always refer to previous applications. So it's far more easier and far more efficient because there are some questions that are going to be the same, especially in a nonprofit world. It's always what's your mission, what's your impact, and how you evaluate. So you can create standard responses and then edit them to the application. Never create a response and then use it for everybody, because reviewers like me will know that. I could tell. I've read applications for like one particular film festival, and they used it for another application that I happen to also be reviewing, and I'm like, that was the same response you did from another application, but it's 2 different funders. What were you thinking? So it's important to have all the documentation, and especially if you get it for the first application, there's only certain times that you're going to have to update the budget. If they require a certain amount of financial documents, it gets updated so often. But your artist statements, you could just edit 3 years from now or 4 years from now, or you can use the same samples, but you may want to update them next year or 2 years or whatever. But if you've got a whole sample of them or you've got all the documentation, it's easier, because then you could just attach them and then work on the actual questions. So it's important to have all the documentation. And you'll get, with every funder application, you'll get more and more different kinds of attachments that they may require, but at least you'll have them in a place where you can access them easily. Yeah.
3 more questions for you. So first of all, I'm going to read from Tomas. I'm applying for a grant to fund a tour, but I'm having a lot of trouble estimating expenses when there are so many contingencies. Flight, hotel, venue prices, et cetera, it all varies. Any thoughts?
So, well, the first question is do you know where the tour is going? Because if you know where the tour is going, you could probably get a guesstimation on hotel. I mean, when you're traveling, it's ground or air, depending on what kind of a tour is it, whether you're going to Baltimore or you're going to Cincinnati. So you'll know what kind of transportation that you're going to need. You're going to need what kind of housing. So if you're touring with 4 people, you may need 2 hotel rooms. And, you can do a search, and I hate to say this, but like hotels.com or whatever, using those dates and figuring out what the average cost is. And then using that, and then putting in the contingency line that, if there's a delay with the air flight, we may need to put people up. I mean, that's almost never happens, because usually the airline does that. But you can put in whatever contingencies based on stuff like that. But if you're doing a tour, you need to figure out where the tour is going, because then you could look at if you're taking a train to New York, you could see what the average cost is. Just go on Amtrak and look at what it is, and then budget around that. And you can always put in the budget narrative, which is a space where you get to explain your budget. You could say, this is based on a search that we did for that time frame. The price may go up or may come down, whichever. And just put that in your budget narrative. But I can't answer that question without knowing where your tour is going, because that's going to be more specific. you know, figuring out where it's going, then you know, plotting, you know, how you're getting there, you know, where you're staying, what you're doing, what you're eating, activities like that.
Is there a certain like like mileage type of pricing or reimbursement, or do you just
If you're driving on the tour,
yeah?
there is an average. I'm trying to think of where. I mean, like for per diem with the government, there's an average mileage. So it's like every mile you get 32 cents or whatever the cost is. I mean, that's something that you could use as the barometer, and then just write that into the budget narrative, saying that we're using the per diem, the government's per diem, you know, per mile when we figure out our budget. So it makes sense to a reviewer how you got that number.
Should the tour budget include an estimate of the income that you think you might get from ticket sales and merch, or should you just include the expenses that you know you will have?
It depends on the funder, because they may ask you both for revenue and expenses. Because they want to see that, you know, within the revenue portion of your application, you're asking, let's say for argument's sake, 1,000, but you have $5,000 in expenses. They're going to want to know where that 4,000 is going to come from. So like doing a budget for the DC Arts Commission, they're notorious for, you know, you put in how much you're asking for from the commission, and then it'll ask you like how much in sponsorships, how much in donations, so on and so forth. And then the whole second part is the expenses. So with that, it balances out so the funder knows that whatever money they're giving you, they know that you're going to go through with the project.
Okay. Okay. So Tomas is asking, the difficulty is that by the time I get the money, prices obviously go up significantly. But I'm hoping to do a tour of the East Coast for a band based in Dallas, Texas. So I'm not sure if that, Tomas, if that answers your questions, but we can come back to that. So another question is, I've seen grant applications ask for like internal support. Does that apply for bands as well? And can you talk about like what that is, what that would include, and are there different things that you think bands should consider versus an individual artist?
I've never seen an application where they ask for internal support. I have no idea what that is.
That was in our GOS application.
For internal support?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does that word mean, internal support?
I have no idea, because
Like
I don't
the
remember
staff?
that being in the application.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. I'll find out in the
But
meantime.
you know, when you're figuring out expenses for an individual versus a band, obviously it's one person versus five. And you also have to think about not only paying yourself by transporting equipment. You know, if you're flying, you may have to pay more for your equipment, and things like that. I mean, one thing that I do is that I just sit down and think about what my project is and walk through everything that I'm doing, and then it comes up in my head. You know, like if I'm doing you know, a seminar on the other side of the city, well, I have to travel, which means, you know, metro fare is one of my expenses. You know, it's a day-long project, which means I got to eat at some point, so that's an expense. You know, just thinking through of everything that you spend money on and for as you go through your project. So if you're doing a tour, it's, well, you know, I have to buy gas, I have to do maintenance on the car. I have to, feed the band members on the way to Dallas. We're going to stop 2 times or 1 time on the way to Dallas. So, it's getting a hotel room either for myself or for 5 people, just thinking through the whole process and figuring out what you're spending money on.
So just on the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities, their support materials includes things like theater reviews, letters of recommendation, certificates of achievement, sample lesson plans, assessments, awards, and on and on and on.
So it depends on the application. That's not the same for every application. Like I hear arts education, I hear GOS, I hear projects. It's a multiple number of applications. For doing a projects grant as an individual, I had to provide proof of, previous projects that I did. If I'm raising money, because I'm working for a particular theater, then I would attach reviews and playbills. So it depends on the application because each application will ask you for different attachments. I mean, some are going to be the same no matter what, like clean hands or something like that. Or, the city has certain attachments like statement of certification, things like that, that everybody has to sign.
Do you want to talk about what the 4 corners are, and then also how do people go about finding out about grants and foundations and things like that?
I don't know what 4 corners is.
So like everything has to be, all your attachments have to be within the application versus having them go outside of the application.
So
like if you have a
That's a-
video,
right,
or
so
something.
that's a fallacy.
Oh.
Because reviewers will be told that they can't go outside the application. Half of them do, just because they're human. And just because they don't necessarily, like when you're putting samples, attachments, a reviewer may not think they're great, but you've added your website in the application. And whatever in the application, it's okay to review. So you can go to their website and be like, there are better samples on their website than they made an attachment. The same with social media. Anything that you put into your application is reviewable because a funder will tell you can only review what's in the application. So if you put in stuff like that, a reviewer can review it. A reviewer is going to review it anyway. No one, I don't know anybody who sits there and says with a straight face, oh yeah, I didn't look outside the application. And not only that, but we live in such a small community. Everybody knows everybody works with each other. Like we know each other's work, we know, different things. So a funder could stay within the application, but most won't. It's just because you always want to give the applicant the benefit of the doubt. So whatever's in the application, it's reviewable. So if you don't think you can slip it in, because it's not a question, then maybe phrase the answer where you can slip it in, because when they ask for samples, both music and video, it's a certain size. And it's very difficult to compress a file where it's still the same because you lose a certain amount of quality when you compress a file. So you could say, these are my samples and I think this is why they're great. If you want to see more, here's my YouTube or, here's my website. And that gives the reviewer an out to look at stuff like that. Because once they get to your website, they're not going to just look at your samples. They're going to look at everything because they're already there. We'd like to think otherwise, but that's the reality. you know. And again, not attachments. Looking for grants, again, you got to use a database. You can do a Google search, and that's just not, I would never recommend that. You know, take time to go to the library and use the Foundation Center's directory. Or if you have a friend who's a development person, they're going to have access to a database, and you can just ask to share or use their database. But those are like really the only ways. And then just looking on a government level, you know, when you think about government funders, think of every level of government, not just city or state, but county. You know, Anne Arundel has an arts coalition or commission. Sometimes NEA gives grants for individuals. That's a federal, well, we may or may not have an NEH, but that's a possibility, hopefully, in the future. And that's how you would look for grants. It's just using a database and getting yourself on those email lists. Another thing you could do is look at music organizations and see who funds them, and then see if those funders have programs for individuals. That's another option. I'm trying to think of where else. Any conference, you know, sometimes I go to conferences, not because I need to hear stuff, I want to go see who's there and see what kind of collaborative or partnerships that I can get myself into. So looking at, you know, different events, networking, that's another option. Sometimes I go to other film festivals just to network because there may be funders there, and it gives me an opportunity to talk to the funder while I network. Another option, you may have friends who've been funded and see who has funded them. So just network, you know, close to you. Those are other options.
Do you think it is worth paying for memberships to things like Grant Station and some of those?
So for an individual, I would probably say no, because you can just go to the library to use the Foundation Center's directory. You just need to call up the library to see if they have a copy, so it's cheaper. Sometimes Grant Station has deals where it's only $99, but I don't know if that's a deal for an individual as opposed to an organization. But something like that, you can go in with someone. I mean, because the database is for a year, so if you go in with someone that's only 50, then that's more economical. So yeah.
I don't think we have any other questions, but let me just ask the audience again real quick.
Well, I'll just, so the gold nuggets of the evening are make sure you do proper research so that you have a defined list of prospects that make sense. You know, you don't want to apply just to apply because you're wasting your time and you're wasting the foundation's time. The other thing is make sure that you answer the questions. And I will say that until the day I die, because people, if they don't know how to answer questions, just write gibberish. And reading 3 paragraphs of gibberish doesn't do you any value because you get marked down because every application gets scored numerically. So you want to make sure that you answer the question. If you can't answer the question, then you could do actually one of 2 things. You can either call up the program manager if they have that availability, where you could ask them, or you can answer the question saying, I don't know, but finding an uplifting answer to it. So, you know, saying, I don't know who my audience is, because when I look on Facebook, that's one audience, but when I look at a crowd, that's another audience. So I would like to use, you know, part of the money to do an evaluation program so I can figure out truly who my audience is. The other thing is don't rush. Make sure that you have enough time, because reviewers can tell if you rush an application. And, you know, a lot of applications may ask a question a different way, and they're doing that on purpose for two reasons. Obviously, they've run out of questions to ask, or they want to see what you say differently, or they want to see it in a different frame. So again, just answering those questions, making sure you have enough time, don't rush your application, do your attachments. Make sure that you have an email address where all the announcements are going so they don't get lost between your, you know, advertisements from Costco or whatever. And make sure you have all your documents in one place. Because sometimes an opportunity may come up and you only have 4 days to apply for it, you know, because you weren't on their radar. If you have all your attachments and you have all previous applications, shouldn't take you more than a day or two to put that application together. And then boom, you have another opportunity to get funding. One thing that I will do after this, I usually teach filmmakers, so I have a deck just for filmmakers. So I'm going to edit it for musicians, and then we'll have Jenny send it out.
Do you also do workshops for nonprofits?
I don't anymore.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that. I'm posing questions specifically.
Right. I mean, we can always figure it out. I'm the festival director for the Real Abilities Film Festival, which is a festival about and for people with disabilities. It kicks off on Thursday and goes to March 6th. So I'm doing like a filmmaker grant writing seminar within that time, but after the 6th, I have to take a break because it's literally my last in-person kind of program. And so I'll need to figure out after that where I'm going to go. Because
where are the films? I would love to see that.
So the films are basically in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So we're screening at the Poses Jewish Community Center in Fairfax. We are screening films at Docs in Progress in Silver Spring, in the Hill Center on the Hill, at the Kennedy Center. So we are screening a lot in different spaces. We're also screening at the Northern Virginia Community College at the Alexandria campus. So all our screenings for the festival this year are being held within the January to March. Then we'll do a virtual film festival in April, because we have access to a lot of filmmakers, but they're not here. So we're going to do a virtual film festival. That way we can do discussions after the film, you know, on Zoom. They can stream the film and then have a discussion afterwards, and it's all virtual. And we have other things planned.
Can I look up the name of it and just keep it so I don't forget?
Real Abilities.
Real Abilities.
Yeah, we're the Greater Washington affiliate. And
I've
another
never
thing.
heard that.
Yeah, we're 12 years old and most people haven't heard of us because the marketing hasn't been as extensive as it has been this year. Another thing we're going to do is a hiring fair in the arts and culture sphere in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So we have a lot going on.
The word real and then abilities?
It's all one word.
Okay.
So it's Real Abilities. Yeah.
Very cool.
But we can talk about organizations, because I used to do that for WALA. Well, and individuals.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Does everyone know about WALA? Because I volunteer there too, and I was hoping like if someone got into trouble or they needed help, they could ask for it.
You know, I don't know what's going on with WALA. I'm in my little sphere because I'm Latin, and part of the LGBT community. So both of my communities are being hit up, and my mother has a green card.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So, I mean, she's passed away, but the fact that he wants to do birthright, and I'm like, well, it's protected by the Constitution, but my family doesn't know that, so they keep blowing up my phone. They're like, you can move to California, or you can moved to New York, or we have a bedroom in Washington State. And I'm like, the more it goes on, I'm like, all my work is remote.
It's gonna be enjoined. I mean, that's gonna be stopped in the courts right here in a short.
Yeah. And I mean, the sad,
The fear is real though, because they can
Yeah.
round you up based on how you look, whether you're legal or not.
yeah,
that's what-
I mean, the biggest hit is going to be the nonprofits, especially in arts and culture, because we've already seen a lot of the money go to civil rights organizations. So it's like, what money is going to be left for arts and culture if everybody's fighting, for civil rights? So yeah, I mean, it's competitive, but there's still a need. So there's still a niche, but it's creating that application that's going to get funded.
Do you have any
Yeah.
other questions?
No, but I think arts and culture is fighting for civil rights.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Went to the museum an hour earlier before I came here, and everything in there is about protest and speaking up and resisting.
And
Yeah.
we were talking about Fringe Festival closing now and what those people are all gonna do. I mean, do we have an alternative to
Well,
Fringe?
I have a thought on that, but I'm not willing to put it on tape.
Well, we can,
Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
Good luck.
yeah. Yeah, let
We
me
all
stop
need each other.
this.
This is some trying times here. We gotta stick
Yeah.
together.
All right, well, thank you very much, Paul, for doing this.
Of course.
And thank you to the audience who joined us today. And if you guys sign up, even for the workshop after the fact, we will get you that slide deck that Paul was talking about.
And I also will have my email on that slide deck, so if
Yep.
you have additional questions after the fact, then I can just answer them for you.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank
All
you so
right,
much.
thanks so much.